Hi there, friends. We're trying to do a live stream to Facebook just to see how this works out. So, a lot of people seem to be having some confusion about this whole virus pandemic thing, and they're throwing around a lot of different terms. Like there's the virus, which they call coronavirus. But it even gets more specific than that. It's SARS-2 or SARS-2 nCoV or 2019 nCoV. So there's a virus and then there is a disease. So what does that mean? What is a disease? And then there's a syndrome. What's the difference between a disease and a syndrome? Well, so it really helps us to understand all this stuff because it helps us figure out, it helps us decode the language of the mainstream news. And this is really an important thing to do. I'm not promoting any particular theory here. I'm just helping you understand some of the language here and some of the models that are being used, okay? So, in the West, we have this thing. In the West, we have this thing called the pathogenic theory of disease. I like to call it a story. It's a story of disease. It's a narrative. And the idea is that there's this little, microbe. It's a virus or a bacteria or a fungus, something like that, or even maybe a parasite, or maybe a chemical toxin. And this pathogen causes the disease. Well, what's the disease? The disease is really a syndrome. It's really a cluster of symptoms. And that's really where we have to begin, okay? If we're going to claim that a disease is a thing, then we first have to begin with a well-defined syndrome, and that's a cluster of symptoms. The next thing we have to do is we have to identify a suspected pathogen. You come up with a theory. You use your cleverness. You look around. I mean, there's a long... Selecting a suspected pathogen is beyond, what is involved in that is way beyond the scope of this discussion. But let's assume that you have identified a suspected pathogen. Let's say it's a virus. So then what you have to do after you identify a suspected pathogen, then you have to apply what's called the Koch's postulates. And there's really 4 of them, but you can really summarize it in terms of there being just 2. And the first is that the pathogen should be found in all people that have the syndrome, and the syndrome is the cluster of symptoms. Let's say the cluster of symptoms is, runny nose, fever, headache. Okay, in this particular thing that's going around, the pandemic, not so many people have the runny nose, but they have it in their chest. They get pneumonia, they get fluid in the lungs, and there's cough. But not so much with the runny nose. So. But they do have fever, and they have trouble taking in oxygen. So that's kind of the cluster of symptoms that we're talking about here. But in China, there's other things going on. People are just falling over in China, in Wuhan, and we're not really seeing that other places. So do we have a well-defined syndrome? That's my question. Is what's going on in China the same thing as what's going on in America? The same thing that's going on in Italy? Or do we have different things going on here? So that's the first question. Do we have a well-defined syndrome? And by the way, let's talk about HIV causes AIDS. So, because that's another example of where we have a virus, the HIV virus, and we have the syndrome, which is called Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. Okay, S is the syndrome. So there's a theory that says that HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, that's what they call this thing, does that cause AIDS? And they even call this theory together HIV/AIDS. That they put those two things together. They put the virus with the syndrome, okay? And let me just say that there is a it's not an open and it's not a question without controversy. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this question, go look up a guy called Peter Duesberg. And so Peter Duesberg famously said that HIV causes AIDS does not pass the Koch postulates. And we're going to continue talking about those two things, what make the two parts of Koch's postulates in just a second. But I want to go back to this idea of defining, do you have a well-defined cluster of symptoms? And with AIDS, we don't. With AIDS, we have a big grab bag. We've got Kaposi sarcoma. We've got Burkitt's lymphoma. We've got cervical cancer. We've got different types of... we've got anal cancer. We've got a primary central nervous system lymphoma. We have hepatitis C, tuberculosis. We have this chronic wasting disease where people lose weight. They're saying all of those things is part of the syndrome that defines AIDS. Well, it doesn't look like it passes the first part of the first step of this whole thing in defining a disease, and that is to begin with a well-defined syndrome. AIDS doesn't begin with a well-defined syndrome. So, and we have to think about COVID-19. Is COVID-19 a well-defined syndrome, or is it a grab bag too? The people falling over, standing up, just bam, falling over in China. Is that part of what we're calling this COVID-19 syndrome? They're already calling it a disease. The D stands for COVID, stands for coronavirus disease, COVID. So they're already making the claim that COVID-19 is in fact a disease that is caused by this SARS-2 novel coronavirus. So we're trying to figure out, did they really do that? Did they really prove that they have a disease? So once we have identified this suspected pathogen, whether it's HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, which is really it's really a herpes virus, and herpes viruses are very common. And then in this case, we have the coronavirus. By the way, the coronavirus is also very common. And in the 1960s, they decided that one of these coronaviruses was responsible for causing the common cold. That's up for debate. Other people say the common cold is caused by a bacteria. So it's an open question. What causes the common cold? Maybe they still don't know. But I'm just saying, in the 1960s, they did attribute the common cold to a coronavirus. Might not be this 2019 novel coronavirus. Different coronavirus. Okay, there's these coronaviruses that are extremely common, and we all have them in us. And keep in mind that there are other. The Western pathogenic story of disease is not the only story. There's the Ayurvedic system from ancient India, and these other theories may be just as valid as this theory, because there's a lot that science claims. These science zealots, or these science fundamentalists, or science fascists almost. If you point out the limitations of science, or something like that, you question somebody with a PhD, they start calling you things like anti-science. But this is science. What we're talking about here is science. It's not anti-science. We're trying to follow the science, and we're trying to fact check the news. We're trying to fact check these official sources. And when we do try to fact check these official sources, we quite often find that they're spreading confusion, okay? So, once again, the first part of Koch's postulates, which I'm going to summarize into 2, okay? There's really 4 if you look it up. It's a little complicated, but these 2 encapsulate the whole thing. Number 1, you should show that the pathogen should be found in all of those with the syndrome. Okay, so in the case of HIV/AIDS, okay, if you have a person that you're saying is expressing this well-defined syndrome, which AIDS isn't, then you should find this particular pathogen that you've identified in step B that you think causes AIDS. You should find that in everybody that's expressing the AIDS syndrome. That's the first part. So if you find one person that is expressing this, this symptom, whatever it is, it's a grab bag in AIDS, in the case of AIDS, but in the case of COVID-19, it might be something like, pneumonia, or there's these lesions that show up. They call them ground glass nodules, something like that. That shows up in a CAT scan of the lung. That's a symptom, okay? So anybody that's exhibiting the symptom, you should be able to find this particular pathogen. That's the first one. The next part is, and this is the final part of Koch's postulates, that you have to demonstrate that this pathogen causes the syndrome in everyone that's infected with it. So if you find somebody with the pathogen, but they're not expressing the symptoms, if they're asymptomatic, maybe you got the wrong thing. Maybe you got the wrong pathogen. Maybe you need to go back and start over and go back to B. You might have to go back to A and make sure you have a well-defined syndrome, and then go back to B and make sure that you have identified a good suspect for the pathogen. If you don't pass the Koch's postulates, one idea is that you haven't done your work, you don't have a well-defined syndrome, or you haven't identified the correct pathogen. So let's look at COVID-19, okay? Let's apply. We've already seen, if we take AIDS and go through this, we'll find that AIDS does not begin with a well-defined syndrome. The pathogen is not found in all the people with the syndrome, and we also, it fails every step. The theory that HIV causes AIDS fails every one of these steps, okay? So I gotta lower that. Anyway, I don't want to do that on the fly. I'm just going to leave it. Do you see what I'm saying? HIV causes AIDS. That theory fails this whole thing here. So now we have a new one today. We have this theory that this 2019 novel coronavirus causes this syndrome. It's really a syndrome at this point, I would say. This COVID-19 syndrome. Let's go through this one, right? So, is it a well-defined cluster of symptoms? Well, no, because the symptoms are different depending on the place. So it looks like they're fudging that, okay? So, okay, now, do we have a well-defined suspected pathogen? We have identified this pathogen we're claiming is the 2019 novel coronavirus. But wait a minute, if we go to step one, this pathogen should be found in all those with the syndrome. If you read the news, what are they saying now? For the past couple of weeks, they've been saying, in Europe, it's mutating. It's mutating. It's changing. It's changing all the time. The virus, the strain that's in Italy is different from the strain that's in Spain. And that's different from the strain that's in America. And that's different from the strain that's in South Korea. If they're all different strains, have you gone back to step B? Have you identified a suspected pathogen? It sounds like you're saying, yeah, that's the suspected pathogen. And that is too. And that is too. They're different, but they're the same. So there's pure confusion here, friends. There's pure confusion. And by the way, if you look at the history, one of the lead proponents of this, I would call it a bogus theory that HIV causes AIDS, is Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's been one of the main proponents of this thing, and now he's also in charge of, he's one of the lead epidemiologists that's on Donald Trump's advisory team on this pandemic advisory team. So I'm just letting you know. I just wanted to make this little short video. I don't know how long we've gone. 26 minutes. We've already gone way too long. So 27 minutes. Just wanted to put this out there, friends. Just wanted to make a really quick video. And wanted to let you know that I do work in the public interest, and I survive on donations and grants. So if you appreciate the work that I do, I would appreciate donations in any amount. I have approximately $500 deficit every single month, and this month might actually be worse. I have additional expenses. So donations in any amount are appreciated. The easiest way is to donate is via PayPal, and my PayPal is right up there. tinyurl.com/donate2BillHuston, tinyurl.com/donate2BillHuston. And if you want to send me a check, you can go to my snail mail. William Huston, P.O. Box 22, Endicott, New York, 13761. Okay, that's it, friends. We will see you soon.